Hello, this is Dr. Stanley for Anthropology 415, 515 Ethnographic Methods. We had technical difficulties yesterday, and for those of you who've watched the video, know that there's no sound on the video. So I'm going to re-record a quick video just to kind of bring you up to speed if you missed the live class yesterday. We talked about a number of different concepts in the class. We talked about definitions, especially of concepts that you might be trying to understand in this class. I'm talking about the difference between conceptual definitions and operationalized definitions, right? Conceptual definitions being more colloquial, right? Thinking about, for instance, what is machismo, right? Is a concept we might try to define in anthropology. We talked about this in class yesterday for those of you who are here, right? So we might define machismo in kind of a colloquial sense as, male dominance in society. But the question is, how do we actually operationalize that in social science? And so when we want to kind of study these things, we need to create indicators. And these indicators will help us score concepts in a quantifiable way. So, for instance, if we were going to study machismo, we might look at indicators such as number of children in the household, right? We can write down an actual number about how many children there are. We could also look at the difference in income between men and women. We could look at incidents of domestic violence, and then we could score levels of machismo in particular households. We could also do a similar thing with tribal identity, right? Tribal identity is a concept that we use a lot in anthropology, but it's often hard to define. So we could operationalize that definition rather than being like, is someone have tribal identity or not? We could say, here are some indicators of tribal identity. Do they speak the traditional language? Do they live on the reservation? Do they participate in traditional religious ceremonies? Do they participate in local government? And then we could score those either as yes or no. And then at the end of that, we could add up those scores and make cuts about who counts and who doesn't, right? So if you've scored more than three yeses on these indicators, we'll say that this group is, has traditional tribal identity, and less than that, we can put into another group of people who have weaker tribal identity. Operationalizing is important because it helps us define what we're actually studying. Oftentimes when people read your research, one of the major problems that can happen is people, the reader can have a different definition of what you're studying than maybe you do. So it's good to lay out both your definition of what concepts you're studying, as well as how you actually plan to operationalize figuring out whether this is true or not, right? And you're going to have some experience practicing that this week in your homework number one, in which you'll practice operationalizing a couple different variables. Another thing we talked about this week are variables and different types of variables, especially in terms of levels of measurement. When we talk about variables, right, variables like we talked about last time are things that can change, right, measurements that can change. And we often think about this in terms of the hard sciences, but we're also going to be using this in the social sciences as well. When we talk about variables, we can talk about them on a number of different measurement levels in terms of their specificity, right? Nominal variables are variables where it's just a list of names which you can check, right? A good thing to think of this, or a good example, is if you were taking a survey and it asked you what your religious affiliation is, right? You could have a number of different boxes on that survey, and you could check, Catholic, Baptist, Methodist, or whatever, right? When we do nominal variables, it's really important that these things are mutually exclusive to each other, which means that if you're, again, with our example of a what religion survey, you want to make sure if you're creating that survey that you don't have something like choose your religion, right? Hindu, Baptist, Catholic, Protestant, right? Because Baptist is a type of Protestant, and both Catholic and Protestant are types of Christianity. So, which compared to Hinduism or Buddhism, right, is a overarching term for that religion. So make sure that your boxes that you put are all at the same level. But just because something is mutually exclusive doesn't mean that you can only choose one box. In fact, the census is a great example of now being able to choose more than one box for your ethnicity, even though these categories are mutually exclusive. You can pick Pacific Islander or Native American. Both doesn't force you just to choose one or the other anymore. The higher level of variable or a higher level of specificity when measuring your variables is to move from a nominal variable to an ordinal variable, right? Ordinal variables are mutually exclusive and generally exhaustive, just like a nominal variable, but they're often, you can rank them. That's the major difference, right? And oftentimes, great examples if you're taking a survey, imagine you went to Sodexo for lunch, or wherever you went for lunch, and they had a survey about whether you enjoyed your lunch, right? Strongly agree, neutral, disagree, strongly disagree, right? That's an example of an ordinal variable. Strongly agree is always going to be more than disagree, right? You can't mix up those orders in a way that if, for our nominal variables, oftentimes there's not a specific ranking. So, right, there is no ranking between, Catholic, Baptist, Methodist, Lutheran, right? You can't put those in any specific order beyond maybe alphabetical, but that's not really important for our research. On a higher level of specificity is an interval variable, right? These are, again, like ordinal variables in that the variables are ranked with each other, but there is a system of numbers in between them. And so you can actually measure the difference, right? The temperature outside is a great example of both an interval variable, but a more specific kind called a ratio variable, in which that interval starts at true zero. So we have 0 degrees Fahrenheit, and we can say today was 90 degrees and yesterday was 85 degrees, right? So it's 5 degrees difference. In general, it's not super important to kind of memorize these names. But what is important is that you always want to collect data at the highest level of precision possible, right? So when you collect data, if you can collect specific data, you can always make that more general, but you can't go from general to specific. So what I mean is if you're going to ask someone, in two versions of a survey, if you were to ask someone, what is your socioeconomic class, right? Are you low class, middle class, high class? As an example of an ordinal variable. We also might ask that same question with what is your annual income, right? That's a ratio variable because you can start at $0 and you can make up to 50,000, 60,000, 100,000 or whatever, right? We can always it's better to take that actual number because we can always group those numbers together. So when we collect our surveys, we have one person at 20, one person at 22, one person at 25, one person at 50, one person at 70, and we can make the cuts in different places because we have that data. And we can say we can make the call about who is lower class, middle class, higher class, versus if we only have those, the ordinal variables of low class, middle class, high class, we can't disaggregate it. And furthermore, we often have the problem of when people answer those questions, they might have different perceptions of what is lower class or middle class than we do. So rather than having everybody kind of make their own distinctions in their head, it's better for us to get as much data as we can and then go from there. And I did this in my field work in Belize when I was talking to cacao farmers. I was looking at cacao production on both the individual level, the household level, and the village level, as well as the national level, right? And so it was important for me to collect data at the individual level and then kind of build it up, right? So I could figure out who was in what household and which households belong to which village, rather than just collecting village level data and trying to do averages. Because what it turned out was that instead of having a relatively average production from all members of that village, what usually happened was there was 3 or 4 really big producers, and then the rest 90% of them were pretty small producers. So it was important for me to have that kind of fine-grained data analysis that you would lose if you just collected kind of averages from larger data sets. When we talk about research, we're going to kind of transition to chapter 3 here. We're going to think about our projects and how we can prepare ourselves to undertake this research in the class, right? When you do your research in this class, there are a number of things that you should consider in terms of whether a project is realistic or not, right? First off, I think you should make sure the project is interesting to you, right? Is it something that you would want to spend time and effort researching? Because if it's not, you're going to have a tough time doing research to motivate yourself to get out of bed and do those interviews or do participant observations. So if you're really interested in it, it's a big help. Is this problem amenable to investigation? Is it something that you have access to, right? There's a lot of cool problems in the world that maybe are not really researchable by you for whatever reason. Oftentimes it's our positionality, right? I might be really interested in studying midwives in Maya society, but because of my positionality as a man, I might not be able to access those interviews or participant observations. Do you have adequate resources to conduct this research? Some research is much cheaper than others. Again, if I wanted to study Loch Ness Monster for my project here, and I wanted to do participant observation in Scotland, it might take a lot more resources than me driving to Roswell to study the Alien Museum down there. Finally, what are kind of the both the practical implications, but also the theoretical implications of this? Well, how does this connect to larger issues? And finally, what are the ethical implications? Is this a project I can undertake ethically, or is it going to be problematic? And we'll talk more about ethics in 2 weeks. The last thing we're going to talk about today is theory, right? This is a methods class, and we have different classes on theory, which you can take, and I encourage you to. But why talk about theory? A lot of grad students, especially, don't like theory, especially when they have to, write it in their prospectus or in their theses. But it's really important, especially to connect your research to larger topics, right? And we talk about theory, we're not talking about things like phenomenology or existentialism or materialism or post-processualism, right? Those are paradigms. Those are those are perspectives. But we're talking about theoretically as things that connect your research to other things going on in society. So, for instance, or in social sciences. So, for instance, if I'm going to study, I want to study witchcraft in Maya societies, there is a body of ethnographic literature on witchcraft in Maya societies, right? Lots of people have written about it because it is kind of a prominent part of that society. And if I'm interested specifically, I'm interested in witchcraft and especially in relationship to economic development. And so I can read kind of the ethnographic sources and create an ethnographic background. But what a theoretical perspective would do would be looking at maybe that on a global or a large scale perspective, right? So instead of looking at accounts of Maya witchcraft and development, I'm looking at maybe indigenous societies around the world and how they interact, or how witchcraft in those societies interacts with economic development. So kind of moving beyond the specific case, think about what other people and other researching other societies or other groups have thought about these topics which you're studying. When we talk about theory in this class, really, again, there's two levels that Bernard talks about. The first is ideographic theory, and that's theory that accounts for the thing that you see in a specific case, right? So in my research, I was looking at indigenous chocolate farming and how 50 years ago, nobody really sold large-scale commercial chocolate because it was considered a ritual crop, sacred crop. But now it's the largest cash crop in the district. So an ideographic theory about why that changed, for my research particularly, could be that I theorized that it was the introduction of Nazarene missionaries into the region in the 1970s, which after mass conversion, cacao lost its sacred nature. And it became the object of commercial development in the 1980s when economic development and agricultural initiatives were put in place by the new post-colonial government to make export commodity and create a tax base, right? That is an ideographic theory about why cacao changed from a sacred crop to a commercial commodity in Southern beliefs, right? It accounts for change in a single case. Conversely, we can have higher order theories, which we might call nomothetic theories. A nomothetic theory accounts for the facts in many cases. So, for instance, in that same example which I just gave, I can talk about, I just gave an example of an idiographic theory which accounts for change in one particular case, like one case study. Why in case study one, something changed the way it did. A nomothetic theory is going to talk about a broad um, theory which you could apply to multiple cases. So, for instance, rather than specifically applying it to the case of cacao Maya people in Belize, I can say something like in traditional or indigenous societies, people oftentimes have an understanding of nature as spiritual or animistic, but religious change and capitalist development often are motivating factors for changing that relationship, right? That is a testable nomothetic theory, which I can apply to multiple cases, right? I can apply that to not only the indigenous people of Belize, the Maya, but also people in Papua New Guinea or the Pacific or in Africa or wherever, right? And I can test that, right? I could say, well, it works in some cases, like I see it work in Belize and it works in Brazil, but in Papua New Guinea, maybe it doesn't work. And so the question is maybe why or what other factors are involved. Um, and so in anthropology, that's really what we're trying to do, right? Trying to get away from kind of this, what we would call intellectual butterfly collecting, just kind of creating case studies. Isn't it interesting? Here's my ethnography of people who believe in the Loch Ness Monster. Well, that's interesting. But if I can instead say something about, religious behavior or people's behavior in terms of the environment and spirituality or, people's understanding of science versus belief or faith, that is a more interesting thing, right? Because it talks about bigger issues and it allows more scholars to interface with your work. Um, when we talk about kind of research in social science, there are a lot of big kind of things, research arenas, Bernard calls them. And we'll be kind of working through some of these on homework number one this week. You can see I printed out some copies. If you're in class, we'll be working on that in class on Friday. If you're online, please join us and we'll be recording it so you can help work through it. We're going to be interested in lots of different topics, right? Things like nature and nurture is something caused by our culture, or is it part of who we are as humans? Evolutionary problem, how things change from one to another. How does cacao change from a sacred crop to a commercial commodity? Internal, external problems. We're working through this again on the homework. How do external facets of our identity, like where we live or our religious affiliation or our political party, influence our internal beliefs and ideas, as well as social facts, right? How do certain social facts or ideas come to be prevalent in society, and what do they mean for those societies? The last thing I want to talk about, like I said earlier, we're going to be working on Friday. We'll be talking specifically about homework number one, in which you'll be working on different types of variables. And you'll be thinking about how we link them together. So I'm just going to go over this briefly, and then you can check it out on the Canvas module. In step one, we're going to be thinking about variables for your project, especially in terms of paranormal and supernatural kind of things that we'll be thinking about in this class. The main point of this activity, at least of step one, is to get you thinking about different kinds of variables. And we could do this with lots of different categories. But Bernard gives 5 different types of variables. And so part one is really to get you comfortable figuring out what type of variable you might be studying. The first kind is internal states. These are attitudes, beliefs, values, and perceptions. The second is external states. These are characteristics that we can see from the outside about people, such as their income, their age, their gender, things like that. Also included that is public affiliation. So like if you belong to Republican Party or the Democratic Party, that is an external state because you are a member of that party, and that is different than your internal beliefs about whether certain issues are right or wrong, or whether you lean conservative or liberal. Number three, reported or observed behaviors. This covers activities that people are doing or reporting of those activities. So, for instance, how long it takes you to drive to work. You could both ask somebody how long that is, and they can report that behavior. It takes me 12 minutes to drive to work. Or you could observe them, right? You could use a stopwatch and you could time how long it takes them to go to work. Oftentimes, it's important to do both because there can be significant difference between people's reported and observed behavior, because you might think that your commute takes you forever, but it really takes you only 5 minutes or something. The fourth kind of variable are artifacts. These are physical residue from human behavior. They are tangible things which you might own, right? You might own a car, you might own a computer, you might own, a book about the Loch Ness Monster. These are all kinds of things which would be artifacts. And the fifth is the environment. This is the physical and social environment. This can be something like where you live, your zip code, how many people are in your town that you live in, the climate of the town, whether it's urban or rural, how old that place is, number of haunted houses in each county that you're studying, anything like that. So once you get comfortable with what kind of variables are which, you're going to fill out the chart in step one with with different kinds of relationships. And on page 3 of your homework, I filled out the chart myself, just to kind of show you how to do it and to show you that it's a doable activity. And you can see how I kind of filled in the boxes, right? Box number 1, you're going to look for a relationship between internal states and another internal state. So, for instance, political beliefs and beliefs about existence of aliens, right? Those are two internal beliefs. And then you'll go through the box. Each number corresponds with a separate relationship, right? Number 1, internal versus internal. Number 2, internal, external. Number 3, internal and reported or observed behavior. Number 4, internal versus artifacts. Number 5, internal versus environment. And the second row, right, external versus external and reported or observed behaviors, external states and artifacts, external states and environment, then behaviors and artifacts, behaviors and environment, artifacts and artifacts, artifacts and environment, and finally environment and environment. So when you fill in those boxes in step 3, what I'll have you do is to hypothesize the relationship between those variables, right? So what do you think is the relationship between those two variables you put? And it has to be a testable hypothesis, right? So if your internal state, box number 1, internal states and internal states, if you're said, well, I think it might be an interesting research question to look at, people's political beliefs, whether they're conservative or liberal, and their beliefs in the existence of extraterrestrial aliens, right? And so you have to hypothesize some relationship, right? I hypothesize that people who are liberal are going to be more likely to believe in aliens for whatever reason, or people who are conservative are more likely to believe in aliens because they are often living in rural environments, and aliens are more often visiting rural environments than the city, or something like that, right? Your hypothesis doesn't have to be, you don't have to prove it at this point, but it should be provable during a social science research project, right? Again, this is just to kind of get you practicing to think about these different types of relationship. All your relationships should be structured something like, I hypothesize that this causes this, or this is related to this because, make sure you have that because statement in there, because that helps us know why you think that, not just that those behaviors are related. In step 3, you're going to operationalize your variables, which means how you might test that concept, right? So for instance, in one of my boxes, I have age of the community versus number of haunted structures in the community. And that is an environment versus an environment variable. One moment. Sorry for the interruption. So for instance, if you were going to hypothesize a relationship, I was kind of going back to that, what we were talking about just a moment ago, if you're going to hypothesize a relationship between behaviors and artifacts, you might posit that there is a relationship between the amount of money someone spends at a New Age bookstore and the relationship they own at least one set of tarot cards, right? And you can say that because people shop at those stores, they're more likely to own, artifacts of those kind of tarot cards. And finally, in the third step, you're going to kind of think about how you might um, operationalize those different variables. So, for instance, if you were going to look at box number 7, the example I gave, external states versus behavior, I might hypothesize that there is a salient relationship between the identified sex of a person and the reported number of out-of-body experiences they've had. How would I operationalize that, right? Well, one way I could operationalize sex is that I could do a survey and just ask the person, check a box, male, female, other. Or for number of out-of-body experiences, right? I might get that through a life history, right? I can ask people, tell me about any out-of-body experience you have. I can record that, and then I can calculate at the end how many experiences they talked about. Finally, the last step of this assignment, you're going to want to answer the following questions. Which of these type of variables is easiest to measure from an ethnographic perspective and why? Give specific examples, as well as which is the hardest to measure and why that might be. And then we'll discuss that next week. So sorry again for the technical difficulties. Hopefully you enjoyed this makeup lecture, and I'll see you next time.